The beautiful Bharat Mandapam, where the President of India is hosting a dinner for the world leaders of the group of 20 countries. It has been pretty much, I use the word historic very, very responsibly and very, very carefully, but indeed today has been a day of historic proportions, no doubt about it. Number one, the biggest takeaway, the New Delhi Declaration has been adopted and has been adopted by consensus. The big sticking point was the Ukraine war. It does find mention in the joint declaration. There are about 8 paragraphs on the Ukraine war, but there is no direct reference to Russia. Some say that the text of the declaration may be somewhat diluted compared to the last declaration that we saw in Bali, but perhaps that's why the declaration got clinched in the first place. We'll talk about that. The second big takeaway, and this is perhaps even bigger than the joint declaration itself, now there is going to be an economic corridor from India all the way to Western Europe, cutting through the Middle East. It'll involve some of the most powerful countries in the world and backed by some of the most powerful countries in the world. From India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, Italy, the European Union, and of course the United States will be a partner in this economic corridor. This is a direct challenge to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the third and big thing that happened today, in a way, opening up the high table of the G20 to the global south, to the developing world. The African Union has now been made a permanent member of the G20. This could potentially pave the way for Latin America in the next year, when Brazil will be the president of the G20, to pave the way for Latin American chair to be also included as part of the G20. So in a way, has the Delhi Summit of the G20 become the gateway to becoming the voice of the global south? These are the 3 broad themes that we will discuss. We'll be joined by a very, very special panel in just a couple of minutes. But first, I want to bring you up to speed with all the sound bites from various leaders, and it was a power-packed list of A-listers, the most powerful men and women on the planet, some of whom spoke today. We want to play out a string of sound bites, and then we'll go across to our guests.
खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है।
All G20 member states have come to New Delhi with a strong sense of responsibility about addressing the most pressing global challenges. Speaking for India, we are clear that no one left behind.
Under the guidance of Honorable Prime Minister, India's G20 presidency has worked for the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future.
आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा।
All my colleagues, this is, someone once said in a similar domestic action that was positive, this is a big deal. This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. One Earth, one family, one future. That's the focus of this G20 Summit. And in many ways, it's also the focus of this partnership that we're talking about today.
We look forward to the integration of the initiative and the Economic Corridor project, which is announced in this meeting. I would like to thank those who worked with us to reach this founding step to establish this important economic corridor. My best regard to you all.
And we are presenting 2 of them today. First, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. This is nothing but historic. It will be the most direct connection to date between India, the Arabian Gulf, and Europe, with a rail link that will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster, with an electricity cable and a clean hydrogen pipeline to foster clean energy trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe.
All right, so we're joined by a very, very special panel on the special edition of Brass Tacks, coming to you live from the Bharat Mandapam, the venue of the G20. Dilip Sinha is India's former permanent representative to the United Nations. We'll also be joined in a moment by Yoshihide Nakayama, who's the former State Minister of Defense of the government of Japan. Bob Blackman, Conservative MP, will also be joining us in a moment. Andrew K.P. Liang is a China strategist joining us from Hong Kong. Cleo Pascal is non-resident senior fellow at the for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And in a moment, we'll also be joined by Robert Lawrence Kuhn, who is a strategic affairs expert and a China expert, in fact. So let me go across to you, Dilip Sinha. Coming into this first day of the G20, over the last 12 hours or so, there was still no consensus on the final document, on the joint declaration. You have seen the language of the joint declaration. There are 8 paragraphs on the Ukraine war. But do you believe that the absence of the word Russia or any direct reference by name to Russia was probably what clinched it?
I think so. I think there was definitely a lot of give and take done by both sides, that is the Western side and Russia, China combined. Both have accepted certain degree of compromised language to enable this Delhi Declaration to come through. If you look at the Bali language, you find that there has been a dilution of that language to enable Russia to accept it and yet be acceptable to the West also, because the West was adamant that there had to be a reference to the Ukraine war, but Russia was opposed to any kind of reference. So the compromise was a reference to the war, but excluding the strong language that was used in Bali, where there was the Russian aggression was deplored in the strongest terms. So that has been withdrawn, and that is how this compromise has been struck, and it has been possible to get this Delhi Declaration through.
Cleo Pascal, Ukraine, of course, has taken objection to the Delhi Declaration, but Ukraine may be incidental to this whole thing. Ukraine was not part of the room where the conversations happened. But do you believe that not naming Russia was perhaps what clinched this deal? It does go in elaborate detail. There are 8 paragraphs referring to the war, how territorial integrity and sovereignty are supreme, how United Nations resolutions need to be respected, the kind of fallout that the war has had on other factors, particularly on the developing world. All of that has been included. The only missing part is taking Russia's name.
I think overall it's an amazing accomplishment. What's happening in Ukraine and with Russia is obviously horrific, but the accomplishments of the other areas of focus, like around health and around multilateral banking institutions and crypto, this is very much a document that's getting away from the G7. The G20 in this document is no longer an adjunct to the G7. It is its own thing, and it is expanding and looking towards the future in its own way. So it's incorporated what needed to be incorporated, and with an incredible move to be able to actually mention it at all and to get the document going. But it is something else. It is a new form of foreign policy with new players, new priorities, new actions. And it is that third element of the goal, that one future element that is actually coming through in this document that I think really is an incredible accomplishment and should be highlighted.
Okay. And Andrew K.P. Liang, more than the joint declaration, that itself has been a big achievement. Had the joint declaration not been adopted, that would have been the headline. So that's a big relief. But more than that, this new economic corridor that's been announced with India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, and Italy, and the European Union, and of course the United States, that is a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative. How would this be read in Beijing?
Well, of course that the Beijing is well aware, or the whole world is well aware, that there is a kind of rivalry between the United States and China, and to a certain extent between India and China as well. So that's well understood. But as far as this new infrastructural linkage is concerned, China always embraces connectivity, as in fact is the most connected countries in the world. That's the reason why China is the largest trading partner for 158 countries around the world, compared with only 57 for the United States. And China is embedded in the global supply and value chain very deeply. So the more the world is connected, the better. The ultimate taste of this new project is that how much trade would India generate, compared with China. China, after all, is multiple times the trade volume and the range of products and the manufacturing powerhouse of almost everything under the sun. So I don't think that Beijing is worried about it. I don't think that Beijing would feel slighted about this, and in fact, Beijing is represented in the G20 through the Prime Minister, and of course the Prime Minister.
Mr. Liang, this is coming exactly 10 years since Xi Jinping announced this, the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Maritime Silk Route and the new Silk Road and so on. Exactly 10 years after that, and we have seen the kind of negative impact that the BRI has in countries in Africa and Latin America, even smaller countries in Asia, the kind of debt, almost unburdenable debt that they are put in. Beijing had a problem even coming into this G20 talking about debt restructuring. That has figured its place there as well. But the fact that these big economies, the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, India, the United States, France, Germany and Italy are all coming together, does that not send out a signal to even the smaller countries that you're not dependent on China anymore for infrastructure funding?
I think that the Global South does not want to be beholden to any particular country, not either the United States or India or China. All they want is to regain their sovereignty and their self-determination according to their own political situation and historical and cultural and geographical situation. And no one wants to be forced to choose a model which doesn't suit the realities on the ground. So I think that the developing world welcomes this additional initiative. But as I said, the taste of the pudding must be in the eating as to how much trade could be generated by linking India together with the Europe. Of course, the more linkage could also benefit China. And in fact, I'm sure...
I also want to bring in Yoshihide Nakayama, who is the former Minister of State for Defense of the government of Japan. Japan, while not being part of this new economic corridor, do you get a sense, Mr. Nakayama, that you have the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, US and India. Now you have this economic corridor all the way from India through the Middle East into Europe. And China, Xi Jinping, was not present in the room today while all these significant announcements were being made. In fact, the Prime Minister of Japan also spoke about this corridor. Japan, of course, has the G7 presidency. Do you think finally the countries of the West, the countries who believe in open and free trade, in keeping sea lanes free, the countries that are opposed to hegemonic behavior, are finally getting their act together with these multiple multilateral sort of arrangements, from Quad to AUKUS to now this economic corridor, in a way, without saying that China is the target, but I think it's obvious to everybody that this is a way to try and counter China. And they realize they can't do it individually, they can't do it on their own individually, but if they come together, if they pool their resources together, China will not be able to match.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and this great program. And I really respect that India led the world now. I believe that Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin missing the opportunity at the G20 Summit extends the time it will take to achieve peace. In other words, by not attending the summit, China and Russia continue to foster an atmosphere of instability in the world. From a Japanese perspective, this could also mean that the likelihood of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, located to our south, is increasingly. Moreover, it is a fact that the military collaborations between China and Russia are increasingly visible in Japan's region. I think it's important not to encourage actions that could provoke war.
Okay. Dilip Sinha, a lot of people here were surprised about how India was able to get through the consensus on Ukraine, particularly without any direct reference to Russia. How did the G7 actually agree to the text of that language, given that countries in Europe, for them, some of them, this war, they've almost seen it from an existential prism, the biggest conflict that Europe is seeing, mainland Europe is seeing since 1945. Is the G7 also now coming to a point for a couple of factors? One, on the ground, there isn't any material sort of gain that Ukraine is making. The conflict seems to be more and more frozen in time. And two, more importantly, the G7 also realizes if this G20 presidency of India's were to be defined as it failed because there was no New Delhi declaration, that would be as much on the G7 as it would be on India. And therefore, they had a stake in India having a successful New Delhi joint declaration. And that's why they agreed to dilute the language.
I think you're quite right. I think both the G7 and Russia were keen that the Delhi summit should not fall flat on its face. It should not be a failure. Delhi should not be the first city where the G20 did not come to a conclusion on did not adopt a declaration. So this was very important. And if you recall, some time back, Prime Minister Modi had spoken to President Putin. I'm sure this would have figured in that meeting. So although President Putin was not here, there must have been some exchange of views as to what would be acceptable. And both Russia and the G7 showed flexibility to ensure that Delhi did not get embarrassed with this on the declaration, because none of the preparatory meetings could come to a joint declaration or a joint communique. They all had chairman summaries. So this was an achievement, and this has to be attributed to the flexibility shown by both sides to ensure that India did not face failure on this count. But if you look at the health of the G20 otherwise, it is not in good health at all. And the global divide is impacting the G20. And the very fact that the achievements that you mentioned of this corridor, that is really a side event. It is not part of the G20. It is a side event that is an initiative of the G7. And within that umbrella, this corridor, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor has been negotiated. China and Russia are not part of this. And the other important side event to this successful summit has been the India-US meeting that took place yesterday. So the two main takeaways from this summit, the success of this summit, are meetings that have taken place on the sidelines of the G20, not in the G20 itself.
Clear, Pascal. The other significant thing that happened today, of course, was the inclusion of the African Union. The first time the voice of the global south, as it were, being given preeminence at this premier forum. And India really pushed for it. There was an anecdote which Foreign Minister Jaishankar mentioned in the press conference. In the last Bali G20, Macky Sall, who was the chair of the African Union at that time, the president of Senegal, had told Prime Minister Modi that the AU needs to find a place, and that Prime Minister Modi reportedly told him at that time, by the next summit, by the New Delhi summit, the African Union will be a permanent member of the G20. And today it happened. Today we saw those scenes. How may this play out? Because China has also made very, very deep inroads in the African continent, huge investments that they've made in infrastructure projects in many, many African countries. But India is the one that is giving them pride of place in a forum like G20. How do you read the sort of permutations and combinations of geostrategy that's been adopted here?
This is India creating a new structure and a new mold. This isn't non-alignment. This is a realignment. This is a realigning of like-minded countries who don't want to be caught in this dichotomy that's been so pervasive for so long, where you've got your choice is China, and it's really exploitative to the point of parasitic economic structure, and the West, which has been doing some pretty inexplicable things lately, and starting with 2007, 2008, which created such devastation globally economically. So this is India saying, look, we've had enough. We need more stability. And you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. For a lot of countries in Africa, the BRI has stood for the Bribery and Repression Initiative. It has not been helpful economically in terms of development or in terms of domestic stability or political openness. So this is a moment where India and other countries can reshape the world in a way that a lot have been asking for.
Okay. Andrew K.P. Liang, you look at the various sort of little multilateral arrangements that are now cropping up. You have the Quad, you have the I2U2. There's also talk about India, Israel, Greece, and Cyprus as another multilateral forum. Now you have this whole economic corridor involving Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. The big message seems to be, if China does not want to be in this room, and Xi Jinping clearly was not in this room, then that's China's problem. The entire world, the rest of the world, the free and democratic world, is going to go ahead and make these multilateral arrangements. And if China has a problem with it, then too bad. That's China's problem. Is China increasingly sort of insulating itself to those multilateral arrangements that it is comfortable with and it is the fulcrum of, whether it is BRICS or SCO? Mr. Liang?
Well, first of all, if you look at the composition of the G20, there is at least one country which is not a democracy. So it doesn't mean that all countries are on all fours on this rhetoric about democracy versus autocracy. And that's the first point. The second point, I already mentioned earlier, that even though democracy may be the best political system, but it is not the only political system that delivers. Democracy, after all, is a process. And then the outcome must be the livelihoods and the happiness of the people under whatever form of government. And using this outcome-oriented yardstick, China has been doing extremely well. Now, as far as the BRI is concerned, of course that China has experienced considerable blowback. But the rhetoric that is all about debt is given a lie by the recent UK-based debt justice research study, looking at how indebted, to whom are they indebted, are the recipient countries. And they found that most of the debt is owed to Western commercial lenders instead of China. And so, of course, there are problems of debt indebtedness. Of course, there is a problem of lack of transparency. And China's now learning along the road, because after all, it was China who launched this global infrastructural project.
I'm not sure of that understanding, because let me get Robert Lawrence Kuhn also into this discussion. He's, of course, a great student of China and a great observer of China. So, two things. Xi Jinping chose to skip the G20 here in Delhi. Whether by coincidence or by design, we don't know, but the Premier Li Qiang was attending. And at that same G20, which the Chinese president decided to give a skip, you now have the announcement of this big economic corridor involving some of the biggest, most powerful economies in the world, from India, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, France, Germany and Italy, and of course all of this backed by the United States. How would this be read in Beijing? Would this not be seen as a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a pet project for Xi Jinping?
The big question is, why didn't Xi Jinping attend the G20? And I have to say that's the very first sentence in my new book published in India by Pentagon Press in New Delhi called Xi Jinping's New Era China, The Inside Story. And the way to begin to understand that question, because that's what everyone's asking, is to recognize that there are not one motivation for things that happen in China, but multiple motivations that come together. And the first thing is that Li Qiang is perhaps the closest person to Xi Jinping throughout his career, which is very different than the first 10 years of Xi Jinping's time in power. So he is now delegating to people who he really trusts, who he has who have terrific track records in running major provinces. So his not attending, but by sending Li Qiang, is very different than it would have been 2 years ago if he was sending Premier Li Keqiang. Very big political difference when you understand China. And other motivations of China's domestic situation, the recent BRICS, where China, of course, was the dominant player. This is a different and this G20 is a great tribute to India. India's emergence in the world with President Biden and President Modi. It's a very different environment. So certainly there are geopolitical things involved. But I think the previous speaker was right in to give credit to China for having started the what they call the Belt and Road Initiative to bring infrastructure to developed countries, to underdeveloped countries or the poorest countries in the world, because this is the most important thing that can happen. And that focus, if there's a quasi-competition in this, that's good, because we want more equality in the world. Inequality in the world is probably the biggest, other than maybe climate change, the problem that the world has. So what India is doing at the G20, bringing the African Union in, having this event, is extremely important for the world. But I do think we need to give China credit for having begun the process. Certainly there's advantages for China in doing it. They're not doing it out of charitable purposes. They get raw materials, they establish new markets, but all that, in a sense, is the marketplace of the world. And everybody is achieving. The great rivalry should be between competent governments and incompetent governments, not political systems that have isms from the 19th century. This is the 21st century.
I'm not sure about that formulation, because I don't know if the view from Tokyo, for example, is the same as what Robert Lawrence Kuhn just outlined. So let me ask Mr. Nakayama. Just a few weeks before this, we saw the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and the United States meet at Camp David. That was a big deal in and of itself because of the history between South Korea and Japan. You have Japan, which is now part of the Quad. You have other countries in Southeast Asia which are not entirely happy with China for territorial disputes and all of this patrolling and what they call hegemonic behavior. Are you seeing small but very important multilateral arrangements which are all now sort of coming together, including today's economic corridor that was announced, coming together in a way to send out a signal to China that, look, you can't alter the rules of this game. There are far too many arrangements involved and there are far too many players involved for you to single-handedly or unilaterally try to change the rules-based order.
Yes, I think the world's most big problem and the issue is Russia and the Chinese collaboration. So I honestly speak straight. This G20 summit for Japan is honestly, it's a strategy against China. Japan and India have the potential to collaborate in areas like maritime security, resources, development, and protection of trade and routes. And the relation to FOIP, Free Open Indo-Pacific, both countries can cooperate based on the Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative, focusing on developing multi-currency payment system and improving governance. India-Russia relations concerning China's alliance with Russia. India's relationship with Russia requires delicate balancing. And also, I spoke about the Taiwan issue. If tensions rise concerning Taiwan, the strategic interest of both Japan and India would intensify. Emergency response mechanism and humanitarian aid could become new areas of collaboration with India. And also multi-phased approach, military cooperation, economic partnerships, and also infrastructure projects, technology, and collaboration in multilateral forms like ASEAN and the Quad, as you said, should also be considered. So I think now the Prime Minister Kishida behind the scene. I'm so sure that Mr. Modi and the Kishida is talking about those kind of like the situation.
Okay, I also want to go across to Robert Lawrence Kuhn, back to him. You know, look at the run-up to this G20. You know, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN meetings that happened in Jakarta. Again, I'm given to understand that some of the conversations that China had with some of its ASEAN partners were not exactly cordial. Leading up to this, we've had two meetings, you know, between China and the European Union, and China and Italy has now officially announced that it's pulling out of the BRI. Increasingly, is China getting lumped with Russia, and thereby is it at a disadvantage? And B, more importantly, you know, if countries around the world are giving out that signal, particularly to smaller countries, where we've seen pushback against the BRI because of unsustainable debt and so on, what may that mean for the signature piece, the signature sort of a showpiece that China has had over the last 10 years, at least in its foreign policy, and that is this massive infrastructure spending in countries which cannot afford to do so?
I think we need to tease apart the issues. Every issue you mentioned are important issues, but they're not part of lumped together. China's relationship with Russia has been a significant negative for China, certainly in the developed world, more than the Western world. And that is a serious matter. We could spend a whole program on discussing the reasons for that, but the outcome is no doubt, especially in Europe, that's been a very significant factor in Europe, and that has affected public opinion, everyone else. The Belt and Road Initiative is a whole different approach. And as I began to say earlier, China has great benefit. China's not doing that for an eleemosynary, charitable, humanitarian purposes. There are those elements too, of course. But China greatly benefits from a diversification of economic interests. China thinks long term. President Xi Jinping's policy goes to 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, when China hopes to become a fully modernized socialist nation, as they say. And there's great plans for that, both domestically and China's place in the world. 2035 is an intermediary date where President Xi probably plans to be in office until at least then. So these are the big factors that motivate China. In this environment, there are two serious problems that China has. One are the border disputes with really everything. The South China Sea is probably the most volatile, with Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines primarily. The Taiwan issue is arguably the most sensitive one in China. Very hard to read how that may go. A lot of posturing. Border with Japan, with the East China Sea, and certainly the severe problems with India. So that's a whole host of what China would say are problems left over from history. But there's a great sense of nationalism. The party uses nationalism as a way to show that it is delivering for the Chinese people. So the party's claim to legitimacy is not based on some ancient ideology, but really two things. One is delivering a standard of living that is impressive, and the second is the pride of China to be back in the world. And these territorial disputes, which I feel are sad and archaic, but to China and to every other nation are very significant psychologically in terms of national pride. So we have all these different issues that are merged together.
Dilip Sinha, one of the other factors which I guess is getting discounted is also how, and Foreign Minister Jaishankar made a mention of this, the countries that actually were very closely involved and played a big role in negotiating the text that finally found its place on the Ukraine war, as far as the Ukraine war is concerned, in the joint declaration, were not the traditional powers that be. It was not the US or the UK or even France and Germany. It was actually emerging powers. And he specifically mentioned Indonesia, the previous president of the G20. He mentioned Brazil, the next president of the G20. He also mentioned South Africa. And he said it was these emerging countries that really, thrashed it out with Russia and China in order to find language that was acceptable to all parties. So are we seeing sort of within this emerging world order, it's not just this great power competition that's going to define our times between the US on the one side and perhaps Russia and China on the other, but you are seeing this emerging group of economies, emerging group of countries that have a huge stake, that have a voice on high tables like the G20, and are going to play that part. Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Indonesia, and of course India.
Yes, these emerging economies, as they're often called, or emerging markets, these are the countries, the developing countries that have made it big. They have become large economies now. They are major players in the global economy, and they would be the biggest losers in a polarized world, in a world where trade gets fragmented, globalization falls apart. In such a world, it is these countries which have recently acquired their prosperity and hope to acquire more in this process of globalization would suffer because of the confrontation that has taken place between the East and the West, particularly between the US and Russia, and now between the US and China. So these countries are extremely keen to ensure that the tensions can ease and normal economic relations can be resumed. And these countries are also not happy with the idea of sanctions being imposed. Many of these countries had actually voted against Russia in the United Nations General Assembly. So they do not like the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They condemn that invasion, but they do not like sanctions being imposed because they feel that that is not in consonance with the way the world was developing in globalization, where politics was to be kept out of trade. So these countries are putting their bit to push these countries, China, Russia, and the West, to ensure that the rules of international trade, rules of economic investment, etc., they are followed, and the gains that have been made over the last 10, 15 years in promoting globalization, and because of which countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia have benefited considerably, those gains are not lost in this confrontation.
All right, clear, Pascal. The fact that, when everybody thought New Delhi will not be able to get a joint declaration, and somehow they managed to find that at the last minute, with the omission of the word Russia in the 8 paragraphs on the reference to the Ukraine war. Of course, the phrase that Prime Minister Modi used, this is not an era of war, this is an era of peace, that's also part of those 8 paragraphs. What is the signal that it will send to Beijing, if at all Beijing were to, contemplate or consider some kind of forced action on Taiwan, given that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is pretty much now frozen in time? We're not seeing any kind of decisive, victory or march towards some kind of a settlement, because it seems to be pretty much frozen a year and a half after it started.
Are you asking me, sir?
I'm asking that to Clear Pascal.
Sorry.
Clear Pascal?
Yes, sir. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think the G20 and China and Taiwan are two separate things. What China's going to do with Taiwan is on a totally different track, and I think that the message that they're taking from Russia-Ukraine, unfortunately, is that, as you said, you don't want it to drag out. If you're going to do it, you're going to do it a lot harder, and they have the capability to cut off communications so that you don't have a heroic figure defending the country. You can't see what's going on. I think they'd be even more brutal if that's possible going in, and use a lot of economic levers. They're very big on this unrestricted warfare component of it. So in that context, the way Russia has gone into Ukraine, I don't think is necessarily giving the lessons we might think to China. However, what will perhaps give Beijing pause is the way, as you've just mentioned, a lot of the rest of the world has come together to say, look, we have these other problems, and we don't want to have to deal with these crazed mass geopolitical issues that are destroying our economies. And most of the countries that you mentioned that have been so influential in shaping this G20 are democracies, and they're democracies where they need to respond to the needs of their people. And especially post-COVID, there has been a real economic recovery problem. And if you're a politician, you need to get reelected. And there are inflection points in a lot of these countries where either you become a country where democracy delivers for the people, or a more authoritarian regime can come in, which is, of course, what Beijing has been pushing for. You see it in places like Solomon Islands, where you try to really give a big hit to democracy. And you metastasize this Chinese system. So the hope that's coming out of this G20 document is really that democracies can survive and can deliver. You can be a politician from a democracy and create a better future for your people. You don't have to shift into this more autocratic structure that China has been trying to export. So that might give them pause, much more so than...
I'll give Andrew Leung the final word. I wouldn't put it as simply as democracies versus autocracies, but I would simply say that, yes, if Russia and China decide to stay out of that room, certainly at the level of their leaders, then it's their loss. It's a loss that they have to bear. Yes, Russia will be very happy at the fact that they've not been named in the 8 paragraphs that mention the Ukraine war, and therefore perhaps that's why they agreed to the language of the text. But this is a big victory for India and for the Western world, in as much as you have a joint declaration that's been adopted despite the fact that the leaders of Russia and China have not attended. So I think the signaling from the New Delhi G20 as we close out this part of the program, Andrew Leung, is that if Beijing and Moscow so choose not to be in the room where the most influential, most powerful people on the planet are meeting, then that's their loss. And they have to face the consequences of that loss.
Well, I don't think that China was excluded from the room. China was represented there by President Xi, by his most trusted confidant, and of course China did contribute to the solution. Now, I'd like to highlight 2 points. First of all, as for democracy versus the autocracy, I've already said that democracy may be the best political system in the world, but it's not the only successful system. After all, it's a process, and the outcome must be measured by the livelihood of the people under whatever form of government. And on that score, China seems to be on solid grounds. Now, as far as Taiwan is concerned, again, one of the things that China has signed up to in the joint in this statement is the respecting a country's sovereignty. And of course, Taiwan is not a sovereign country. According to the United Nations Charter, Taiwan is part of China. It's recognized by the United Nations. So I think that this rhetoric, this double standards about respecting other sovereignty, while certain countries violated other countries' sovereignty either by invasion or by turning the one China policy upside down, speaks for itself.
Okay. We'll see how this plays out, because I think I'm very clear about the big ticket announcements and the message of those big ticket announcements. The joint declaration was huge because everybody thought up until even this morning that Russia and China will play spoiler. They managed to get Russia on board with the dropping of the direct reference. And of course, China had to go along the moment Russia said it is going to play ball. The other big announcement, this economic corridor, is huge. It is of massive proportions, and the impact of it, the messaging it sends out to smaller countries that are crying out for infrastructure funds will be huge. And of course, giving voice to the African Union at the high table of the G20, giving voice to the global south. All of these are going to have huge impacts. Thank you very much to all our guests. I also want to play out a conversation that I had with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and I specifically asked him about this language of the text, which ultimately got adopted as the New Delhi Declaration. He says this is a realistic understanding or a realistic assessment by even the West, even if they don't say it in as many words, but an acknowledgement of sorts that the Russia-Ukraine war is perhaps not going Ukraine's way. The conflict seems to be frozen for all practical purposes, and perhaps the West needs to have more realistic assessments of how far it will go out, almost on a limb, to support Ukraine against Russia. So that's Professor Jeffrey Sachs in conversation with me here on Brass Tacks. All right, so the New Delhi Declaration has been adopted. The negotiations going on to the final hours, even up until this morning. Consensus language has been found. There is, of course, criticism that the language against Russia in the war in Ukraine has been diluted somewhat. And also there is the other big announcement of the economic corridor from Asia through the Middle East all the way to Western Europe. Joining me now is a professor at the Columbia University and someone who has seen very closely the developments of the G20 over the last 15 years or so, since it's been moved to the heads of state and heads of government level. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much for joining us on this special broadcast. First of all, what do you make of this New Delhi declaration? There are 8 paragraphs dealing with the war in Ukraine. There is no direct reference to Russia. Do you believe that was the clincher and that's how all countries gave their consent to this declaration?
This is a very good declaration, and this is a very big success for India. So I would really congratulate the government of India for this. I think everybody was wise to back off of trying to break this G20 over the question of Ukraine, which is a more complicated question, perhaps, than either side wants to admit. It's not all good and evil as the United States or others think. So they backed off, and this declaration focused on a lot of very important matters around economy, finance, sustainable development, climate, fighting poverty. And it is a consensus document, and it's a very well done document. Now, the key is to implement it, but the aspirations that are expressed in this document are really well directed. I'm very pleased with it.
I'm curious to know what's your best understanding of how the West, the US, its European partners, given how polarizing this war was and has become, how did they agree to a text, a draft, which does not mention Russia at all?
Well, I think this is a success of Prime Minister Modi. It's a respect to India as host of the G20. It is a realization, perhaps, by the US and Europe that breaking apart the G20 in this way not only would be an embarrassment to India, but ultimately would be an embarrassment to the US and Europe. You know, the world does not see eye to eye with the U.S. government on how it interprets this war. I don't, by the way, at all. I think that this war, in significant part, came from Washington relentlessly trying to expand NATO to Russia's border, and that was extremely dangerous, provocative, and unwise. Well, the United States doesn't view it that way. It wants to blame everything on Russia. But the fact of the matter is, most of the world doesn't side with the U.S. on this. Most of the world sides with peace, and would the leading powers stop making trouble for everybody and sit down and negotiate. And that's really the spirit of this document. And I think it was a lot of very capable diplomacy by India, and personal diplomacy, I would add, by Prime Minister Modi, that brought the success to this joint declaration and to the summit.
I also want to know your thoughts on this new economic corridor that's been launched from India, involving the UAE and Saudi Arabia, going all the way to France and Germany, of course, backed by the United States. Do you think this is a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative of China?
You know, it's a road, and it's good. Of course, the United States, again, the U.S. government is almost childish in seeing everything as something against someone else. This is part of the needed interconnections across Eurasia. So it's desirable. It is absolutely complementary to the Belt and Road Initiative. If we could actually behave better than children and not see everything as a challenge to someone else, but actually as something where we cooperate, we would understand the world better and make the world better. This corridor sounds like a very good idea, but it's part of the same vision as the Belt and Road Initiative. And I want the United States government, I hope the government of India and others, don't badmouth the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very valuable initiative. It is complementary to this initiative, but it's all part of the same idea of creating an interconnected, modern, peaceful infrastructure of trade. And in this sense, I'm happy with this initiative, but I'm not happy with it being called a a rebuke to the Belt and Road or an answer to the Belt and Road. That's nonsense. It's a road, is what it is, and it's a corridor that we need.
And very quickly, how may, many are saying that the G20 here in Delhi sort of symbolizes or ushers in a sort of a slightly more nuanced positioning when it comes to this emerging world order. The war in Ukraine, clearly, it has not gone as per the West's expectations or as per Ukraine's expectations. So maybe there is a bit of a tempering down of the West's own capabilities and perhaps certainly Ukraine's own capabilities. And now you have this corridor involving US partners and allies, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Middle East. And then you have France, Germany and Italy in Western Europe. Is this a pitch yet again by the US? Of course, incorporating countries like India to once again push collectively through these multilateral channels and fora, perhaps in a way to send out a signal to Beijing.
Again, we are in a multipolar world. We're in a world where China is a superpower, India is a superpower, the United States is a superpower. We're in a multipolar world. The idea that this is a game where now the US and India team up against China is not a reality. India has its own interests. China has its own interests. The US has its own interests. Everybody needs to behave respectfully because each region is powerful. Each region is part of a global cooperation. This is not a game. This is not a game of chess. This is not a game of Risk. This is not a game on a chessboard. It's not a game at all. It's actually our one Earth, one family, one future, to quote the opening line of this G20. And so I really want us to move beyond, can the US create a new alliance against China? That is America's thinking, but I have no patience for it. It's absolutely anachronistic to think that India is somehow going to side with the West against China is very naive. India is a major power of 1.4 billion people with a lot of interests and a lot of complexity and a lot of strong positive relations with China and a lot of difficult relations with China. And suddenly, India is not suddenly going to be part of the West. India is actually the main part of South Asia. South Asia is an even bigger part of the world. But the idea that you somehow put these pieces together in these alliances is, to my mind, outmoded thinking in an interconnected, multipolar world. And of course, it's America's thinking, but please, everybody should remember, what is America's idea? It's to be number one in the world. Well, how silly is that? That's childish. That's still America's idea. I would not succumb to it, frankly.
All right. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts on the New Delhi Declaration and what's been achieved in this Delhi edition of the G20 Heads of State Summit. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
Is in place. Vehicles who are trying to move inside the central Delhi or the NDMC area from towards ITO, they are being checked, they are being frisked at different checkpoints that have been made out here, making sure that no unauthorized person is allowed to go inside the place where the G20 event is happening or even anywhere close to the NDMC area, because remember, the movement of delegates have started, the movement of the head of states have started, and they are slowly reaching towards the Bharat Mandapam, from where the massive G20 event will start, which will actually pitch the idea of a new Bharat, a Bharat that is ready to take on the world, and that is what we are going to see over the next 2 days. You can see in the visuals over here that each and every person, either from the medical staff or from essential services, their passes are being checked, their ID cards are being checked, their passes for their vehicles are being checked, and post that they are being allowed to go inside. They are being allowed to go anywhere inside the NDMC area, and this is the kind of security that we have been reporting out here at CNN News 18, that there is absolute watertight security that can be seen on the ground, making sure that in this big ticket event there is no lapses, there is no loophole that is left, and that is the reason why not only the Delhi police but also members of the ITBP and central police forces have also been deployed to make sure that there is absolutely no issue, or there is.
Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 a.m., movement from various hotels taking the heads of states and delegates to the Bharat Mandapam is beginning, and ahead of that, security bandobast is being tightened further. You can see these are roads from near Hotel Oberoi, near Hotel Lodhi, and also the Claridges which hosts the French heads of state and the French delegation. So in that generic area, multiple layers of barricades have been put up. Delhi police is manning these barricades. Even people with valid I cards are not being allowed to move further. Till yesterday, even though this flyover takes you, this is still South Delhi, this is not New Delhi area, but until yesterday, people were being allowed to move, but today, there are multiple layers of barricading here. Delhi police is here, paramilitary forces deployed as well. More barricades have been brought in, and they are ensuring that people don't really cross over this area. This will ultimately lead you to Bharat Mandapam. What is the drill that is being followed as far as movement of heads of states are concerned? Advanced security liaison has been conducted. There are security and liaison officers sitting with the heads of the security delegations of the various countries and really figuring out movements, etc. There are specific flags, specific routes that are marked. There are contingency plans as well. When a head of state moves from the hotel to the Bharat Mandapam towards the Pragati Maidan area, if there is an exigency, there are routes that have been marked as to where the driver, specially trained driver, can take the car carrying the heads of state. And here you see, as police is stopping more and more vehicles, even checking the I card, even government I cards are being checked, and only then are they being allowed to move, but not being allowed to move further, as you see.
Approximately 200 meters away from the Bharat Mandapam, that is going to see all the head of states coming out here and attending this G20 Summit. And as you can see in the visuals over here, there is absolutely watertight security that can be seen on the ground. Absolutely no one is being allowed to enter the central Delhi area at this point in time unless they have the requisite passes and the requisite permissions. Senior officials of the Delhi police are on the ground making sure that the entire security arrangement is in place. Vehicles who are trying to move inside the central Delhi or the NDMC area from towards ITO, they are being checked, they are being frisked at different checkpoints that have been made out here, making sure that no unauthorized person is allowed to go inside the place where the G20 event is happening, or even anywhere close to the NDMC area, because remember, the movement of delegates have started, the movement of the head of states have started, and they are slowly reaching towards the Bharat Mandapam, from where the massive G20 event will start, which will actually pitch the idea of a new Bharat, a Bharat that is ready to take on the world, and that is what we are going to see over the next 2 days. You can see in the visuals over here that each and every person, either from the medical staff or from essential services, their passes are being checked, their ID cards are being checked, their passes for the vehicles are being checked, and post that they are being allowed to go inside, they are being allowed to go anywhere inside the NDMC area. And this is the kind of security that we have been reporting out here at CNN News 18, that there is absolute watertight security that can be seen on the ground, making sure that in this big ticket event there is no lapses, there is no loophole that is left, and that is the reason why not only the Delhi police but also members of the ITBP and central police forces have also been deployed to make sure that there is absolutely no issue, or there is.
Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 a.m., movement from various hotels taking the heads of states and delegates to the Bharat Mandapam is beginning, and ahead of that, security bandobast is being tightened further. You can see these are roads from near Hotel Oberoi, near Hotel Lodhi, and also the Claridges which hosts the French heads of state and the French delegation. So in that generic area, multiple layers of barricades have been put up. Delhi police is manning these barricades. Even people with valid I cards are not being allowed to move further. Till yesterday, even though this flyover takes you, this is still South Delhi, this is not New Delhi area, but until yesterday, people were being allowed to move, but today, there are multiple layers of barricading here. Delhi police is here, paramilitary forces deployed as well. More barricades have been brought in, and they are in.
Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Day one of any summit is usually about handshakes and smiles, getting to know each other, testing the waters. It is usually a curtain raiser for the action-packed final day. But India's G20 presidency has started with a bang. Day one came with some surprises like the New Delhi declaration that was forged after days of deliberation and some historic moments like Africa's inclusion